Okay, get this. Picture yourself walking down a street in Toronto. Maybe you're going to get a haircut. And right upstairs, living a totally normal life, is the last surviving Grand Duchess of Russia.
Wow.
It's crazy, right? Her name was Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. And her life was just, well, full of these twists and turns you wouldn't believe.
Sounds like quite the story.
It really is. And that's what we're diving into today, Olga's story.
Awesome.
We're going to go from, like, the extravagant palaces of Russia to the front lines of World War I, and then end up, in that apartment above the barbershop.
It's amazing how one person can be a part of so much history, right?
Yeah.
Like seeing the Romanov dynasty at its peak and then watching it all fall apart.
It does kind of feel like a Shakespearean tragedy, but it really happened.
Definitely.
So to really get into Olga's journey, we got to go all the way back to the beginning, to her childhood.
All right.
So she was born in 1882 and spent her early years in the Peterhof Palace, this massive 900-room palace outside St. Petersburg.
900 rooms. That's, well, it's almost unimaginable.
I know, right?
Oh,
Can you even imagine growing up in a place like that?
it's hard to even picture that kind of, well, opulence.
Totally.
But here's something interesting. Despite all that luxury, Olga actually slept on this really simple, hard mattress.
Really?
Yeah, just one pillow, too. It's just a small detail, but it maybe tells us a little something about her personality, even back then.
I guess so, yeah. Maybe she was just naturally down to earth, or maybe it was like something her parents did to teach her to be humble.
Could be.
Yeah, who knows? But whatever it was, this pretty idyllic childhood she had takes a really sad turn when she's only 12. Her father, Tsar Alexander III, dies from kidney disease.
Wow.
And he adored Olga, so this must have been absolutely devastating for her. It's like it really shaped her whole life.
I bet. That kind of loss at such a young age, that's going to be tough. And it sounds like this was just the first in a long line of, well, heartbreaks and just upheaval in her life.
Sadly, you're right. It's like the hits just kept on coming. So not long after her father dies, Olga is pushed into this arranged marriage with her cousin, Duke Peter Alexandrovich.
Okay.
But this was not a love match, not even close.
I see.
Pretty much everyone agrees that the Duke was gay.
Oh, wow.
And, as you can probably guess, their marriage was never consummated.
Can you imagine being stuck in a loveless marriage like that? Especially back then, divorce was basically impossible, well, for someone like Olga, at least.
Yeah, exactly. So how did she deal with that? Did she just kind of, like, resign herself to being unhappy?
It seems like she found her own way, her own purpose outside of the marriage.
No.
Yeah, Olga was really passionate about nursing and helping people who were less fortunate. She even had this place called Olgino built. It was like a villa where she could go and get away from all the stuffiness of court life.
So she can focus on helping people.
Exactly. It really shows you she was, a strong and independent woman.
I like that. So it seems like even with all this personal turmoil going on, a little bit of hope comes into her life.
How so?
She meets this guard, Nikolai Kulikovsky, at a military review. And it was like love at first sight.
Oh.
And with this new love, she finds the courage to do something pretty drastic. She asks her husband for a divorce.
Wow, that's a bold move, especially back then. Really shows you how determined she was.
I know, right? But I don't think he granted the divorce right away, did he?
Not exactly. He agreed to a 7-year separation.
Okay.
But here's the kicker. He made Nikolai his aide. So basically, he brought Olga's new love right into their house.
Oh my gosh. Talk about awkward.
That's an understatement. So for over 10 years, Olga lives in this super weird situation, married to a man she doesn't love, but living with the man she does. I mean, how do you even process all that?
That is really complicated.
It really shows how pragmatic she was. She was willing to compromise and adapt to these really tough situations.
Yeah. And keep in mind, all of this is happening while the world around her is changing like crazy too.
You're right.
Because during this time, Olga gets really close to her brother's kids, especially his youngest daughter, Anastasia. They would go out on these little trips together, almost like Olga was creating this, surrogate family for herself.
That makes sense, like she was missing those family connections in her own marriage. And then World War I breaks out in 1914. And Olga does something that shocks everyone. She volunteers to be a nurse on the front lines.
Wow. A Grand Duchess on the front lines.
I know, right? Everyone was surprised.
I can only imagine. So what made her do that?
Well, she definitely had a strong sense of duty to her country, that's for sure. She could have stayed safe in the palace, but she chose to be out there with all the other Russians taking care of the wounded.
Yeah.
And those conditions were often really dangerous and chaotic. It shows how compassionate she was, that she was willing to face that kind of hardship.
So we have this woman who's already dealt with so much personal heartache, this complicated marriage, and now she's dealing with the horrors of war. I can't even imagine.
It really is remarkable, her ability to just keep going, to find purpose and stay strong, even during those dark times.
Totally. And finally, in the middle of all of this, in 1916, Olga gets some good news.
Oh, yeah.
Her brother, Tsar Nicholas II, grants her an annulment from her husband.
Oh, wow. That must have been a huge weight off her shoulders.
I bet. So did she and Nikolai get married right away then?
They did.
Yeah.
And it seems like they didn't waste any time. She married him wearing her Red Cross uniform.
Really?
Yeah, which really goes to show you how committed she was to service and to her love for Nikolai. It's really quite a love story.
It is. But unfortunately, their happiness wouldn't last very long.
Right, because back in Russia, things were about to get a whole lot worse.
Because of the revolution.
Yeah, in 1917, the February Revolution starts, which means the end of the Romanov dynasty and, the whole course of Russian history changes forever. Wow.
And suddenly, Olga and Nikolai are in serious danger.
Oh, no.
They had to escape Russia, and Olga was pregnant with their first child at the time. Can you imagine the fear?
I can. It must have been terrifying.
It was. It was this harrowing journey with all these close calls.
Like what?
Well, at one point, they were even kicked off a moving train in the freezing cold.
Oh, gosh.
But through it all, Olga never gave up. She eventually found safety in Denmark, where her mother was from, and that's where she gave birth to her son in exile.
So by 1919, Olga is starting a new life, a world away from everything she knew. But her past, and what happened to her family back in Russia, especially her niece Anastasia, still haunted her, right?
Yeah, the rumors about Anastasia possibly surviving her family's execution had been going around since 1918.
Right.
And then in 1925, this young woman shows up in Berlin claiming to be Anastasia. Her name was Anna Anderson. And, well, her arrival just throws more fuel on the fire.
I bet. And this is where things get really interesting. Olga actually goes to Berlin to meet Anderson face to face.
Yep.
Wow. I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
Right. Talk about an emotional encounter. And there are all these different accounts of what happened during that meeting.
Really?
Yeah. Did Olga believe Anderson was really Anastasia? Some people say she might have at first, but then later completely denied ever believing it.
So it's a mystery.
Yeah, it really is. So that leaves us with a question, something we'll dig into more when we come back. What was Olga thinking during that meeting? What changed her mind? Was it a real change of heart? Or was there something else going on?
Lots to unpack there.
Yeah, it makes you think, this woman, Olga, she's already lost so much. And then suddenly there's this person saying they're her niece, someone she obviously cared about a lot. Did a part of her want to believe it, even if logically it didn't really make sense?
It's a really interesting question, psychologically speaking. I mean, the emotional burden she must have been carrying, the trauma of her family, but also that little glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone survived.
It's kind of heartbreaking to think about. This young woman, obviously struggling, shows up and says, I'm your niece. I feel like anyone would want to believe that, at least a little bit, even if it didn't totally add up.
Yeah, it's a very human reaction, for sure. And don't forget, Olga was known for being incredibly kind and compassionate.
Right.
Her granddaughter actually said that Olga answered every letter she got, from kings or crackpots. She didn't discriminate.
Wow.
So it's very possible that even if she had her doubts about Anderson, her empathy and her own grief made it hard to just shut her down completely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It really shows how complicated she was and how, trauma can really affect how we see things and react to things.
For sure.
But as we know, the DNA evidence proved that Anderson wasn't Anastasia. And then, tragically, they found Anastasia's remains with the rest of the family.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder that sometimes even the stories we want to believe most are just stories. And it's understandable to want to believe them, especially when you're dealing with a tragedy, but ultimately the truth is what matters, even if it hurts.
So true. So while this whole Anastasia thing was going on, Olga was building a new life for herself in Denmark. For 25 years, she lived on a dairy farm with Nikolai and their 2 sons.
A dairy farm.
Yeah. Quite a change from the palaces she grew up in, but maybe that simpler life was exactly what she needed after everything she went through.
I can see that. It sounds like a really peaceful time in her life.
Yeah. She found happiness in her family, her painting, connecting with everyday people. There are even stories of her volunteering at a local hospital, using those nursing skills she learned during the war.
It really seems like taking care of others was a core part of who she was throughout her entire life.
It does. And even though she was living a quiet life in Denmark, she wasn't completely forgotten. Queen Elizabeth II, who was her distant cousin, was a fan of Olga's art. She even owned some of her paintings.
Oh, wow.
It's interesting, right? Even in exile, she was still connected to her royal past, in a way. But as we've seen, whenever things seemed to be calming down for her, something would happen to shake things up again.
You're talking about World War II, right?
Exactly. In 1948, they had to flee Denmark because they were worried about being sent back to the Soviet Union after the war.
Makes sense.
They ended up in Canada, settling in rural Ontario.
Wow. Can you imagine having to start your life over again at 66 years old?
It's incredible. It just shows how adaptable she was. She never gave up.
Truly remarkable. And what's amazing is that she seemed to embrace this new chapter in her life. Her sons got married, she became a grandmother, she kept painting, capturing these scenes of Russian folk life in her work.
It's beautiful. It's like she was keeping a piece of her homeland with her, preserving it through art.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful way to honor her heritage. And it's in Canada, in that apartment over the barber shop, that Olga lives out the rest of her days. It's kind of a poignant image, don't you think?
It is.
The last surviving Romanovs, someone who saw an empire crumble, ends up living this quiet, simple life, far away from all that grandeur she was born into.
It really makes you think about how unpredictable life is, how even the most amazing journeys can end up in the most unexpected places. What do you think went through her mind during those later years?
It's hard to know for sure, but her granddaughter said that Olga often said, "I always laugh because if I start crying, I'll never stop."
Wow,
It sounds like she made a conscious decision to find joy and laughter even after all that loss.
that's powerful. I guess in choosing to laugh, she was finding a way to honor the people she lost, to keep their memory alive in her own life.
It's a beautiful thought. And it brings us back to that image of Olga, the Grand Duchess, living above a barber shop.
Yeah,
It shows us that even the most extraordinary lives are connected to the everyday. And that even in the middle of historical chaos, these individual stories of love, loss, and resilience, they just keep going.
it's really inspiring.
It is. And before we finish up with Olga's story, we need to talk about her final years and what her life and death tell us about history, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit.
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big things in history, like wars and revolutions. But Olga's story shows us that history is really about people's lives, each one full of its own good times and bad times.
And what I find so inspiring about her is that she never let those circumstances define her. She dealt with so many challenges, but she did it with grace and humor, always determined to find happiness, no matter what.
That's right. She was born into incredible privilege, then she saw it all crumble, had to run for her life, rebuild everything over and over again, and through all of that, she never lost her spirit, her kindness, or her ability to be happy.
And that brings us to 1960, in that apartment above Ray's barber shop in Toronto. That's where Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the last surviving Romanov, who was actually born during the dynasty, passed away peacefully. She was 78 years old. A quiet end to a life that went through empires and continents, revolutions and exile. So much loss, but also love.
It really is amazing when you think about it all. It makes you wonder, what was she thinking about in those last years? Did she feel like after all of it, her life had meaning?
We can only guess, but I think her story tells us something really important about the human spirit. How we can endure and adapt and find meaning no matter what life throws at us.
Yeah. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the personal journeys people take within those bigger events. And it makes us think, how would we handle those kinds of changes in our own lives? How do we deal with huge upheavals? Where do we find the strength to keep going when everything we know is gone?
Those are important questions, and I think Olga's story gives us some clues. It seems like human connection, compassion, a good sense of humor, and being present in the moment, those things can help us get through even the toughest times.
Her story is really a powerful example of the strength of the human spirit. It shows us that even when we lose our titles, our money, our homes, we still have the power to choose how we react to challenges. We can choose joy, we can choose to keep going, and we can choose to find meaning and purpose even in the most unexpected places.
I like that. And if Olga's story has inspired you to explore more fascinating lives and historical events, make sure you subscribe to The Deep Dive. We've got so many more deep dives to share, each one giving you a unique look at the people and events that have shaped our world.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep with us.